This video, we'll be philosophizing on self-exploration as it pertains to distinctions within the overarching personality characteristics, self-desires and or self-discovery and or personality characteristic concerned with self-confidence. Yet, self-confidence is more complex within self-exploration, that one may be high in self-confidence, yet within experientially encountering what is unfamiliar to the self, new and or original and or different, may increase discomfort and or uncertainty, not necessarily meaning an individual lacks self-confidence, meaning self-knowledge and or self-awareness in relation to certain self-preferences connected to essential and or necessitated underlying psychological need satisfactions and or deprivations within the appropriate emotional intelligence to calibrate one's feelings to one's navigational self-knowledge and or self-awareness is more related to self-confidence, not necessarily what's more likely across distinct individuals to result in uncertainty and or influence certain uncertain conducts with less confidence per se within one's demeanor, yet one may still engage verbal and or non-verbal communications of self-confidence within the domain-specific self-knowledge and or self-awareness. One is able to communicate more clearly on with more reliability and or consistency in terms of what's meaningful to their desires. Self-exploration most relates to distinctions within navigating one's desires and or self-preferences directly and or indirectly related to certain underlying psychological need satisfactions, be it that psychological needs are more complex, associated with thirst and or hunger and or sex and or clothing in terms of regulating mind-body connections, internal and or external conditions, changes in temperature that is meaningful for feelings of comfort and or discomfort, feelings of satisfaction and or dissatisfaction, and or feelings of security in terms of a shelter and or security of one's property and or subjective well-being, including privacy in relation to more complex needs associated with individual autonomy and or competence and or affiliation and or meaning in life and or knowledge and or uniqueness that are most meaningful to engage more complex intrinsic motivations to explore the self within the surrounds, unique to one's subjectivity. One may volitionally engage the doable explorations within the surrounding internal volitional mobile conducts one engages within the external world, exploring mostly within one's privacy with the most freedoms compared to the deprivations of privacy. One is more likely to be more inhibited and engage less free exploration. Yet individuals who may be more self-confident within certain situations and or in certain environments, there may be others may engage more self-exploration meaningfully, including certain introverts within certain situations, yet often is more likely to influence within more social situations extroverted individuals. So there may be more distinctions in terms of self-explorations that engage distinct self-preferences, be it that individuals may be more desiring to engage self-explorations within introspections whom are more introverted and or engage less bouncing from conversation to conversation with more desire to engage more meaningful one-on-one communications within often holding more self-confidence and or self-knowledge and or self-awareness within relation to their self-preferences, engaging more meaningful communications with whom they are most desiring to communicate with, amongst the introverts whom are more higher in self-exploration and or self-liberations, engaging more freedoms to appropriately engage the valid and or psychologically true and or meaningful direct perception to navigate what's centralizing to one's appetites of the self, satisfying certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs meaningful to engage the synthesis and or regulation and or migration and or subsequent integration of serotonin in relation to the appropriate dopamine that's navigating more positive, future-oriented meaning and affect associated with what an individual prefers and or infers within future-oriented experiences is more likely to repeat again and or engage more meaningful communications within satisfying certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs, often for meaning in life and or uniqueness, and or in individuals who are more higher in need for cognition, that's more unique to personality characteristics, are more likely to satisfy the need for knowledge, which is distinct. It's more related to the underlying psychological needs, the need for knowledge instead of need for cognition, more related to intellect and or openness to exploration, as one is more engaging certain intrinsic desires to explore and or deepen expansivenesses within one's libraries of self-knowledge and or self-awareness, and or connect certain meaningful concerns to elaborate prior existing self-knowledge and or self-awareness that one may be curious and or desire exploring within the needs of a communication. The personality characteristics most related to exploring one's inner world involves self-discovery, related to self-interest and or meaningful concern. Meaningful concern tends to engage absorbativeness. This is related to the other dimension of introversion associated with introspective explorations that's meaningful for engaging the self within, responding often to certain desires to solve complex problems, yet is most related to self-discovery and or the calibration of an individual's self-preferences within self-discovery, connecting what is most meaningful to the self, sensitive within individuals whom are higher in openness to exploration on more moral and or ethical issues, yet in other individuals may concern more often property and or personal items and or what individuals think and or perceive to be sacred is most related to an individual's meaningful concerns. One may engage self-discovery more in relation to connecting with what one is more meaningfully concerned with and or exploring certain intrinsic motivations as to what are the intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties, one is more likely to engage more meaningful utterances of thought in terms of the amount of analytic terms. One is engaging relevant and appropriate and or meaningful utterances of thought to connect distinct vocabs to the exploration within one's being of what is meaningful to the self, amongst cultivating self-interest that's more related to engaging certain desires related to explorations. This is related positively to self-desires that's most related to fueling certain intrinsic motivations and or engaging one's self-desires in terms of satisfying certain self-preferences. So there's more of a direct relationship with self-preferences and the navigation to satisfy certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs, with desiring certain direct and or situated component parts and or processes within one's future-oriented direct perception in order to satisfy the relevant and or appropriate and or meaningful pangs of deprivation within what one engages more fantasizing and or mentalizing of the step-by-step desires to obtain certain experiential encounters with certain events and or internal and or external conditions of satisfaction meaningful to satisfy directly and or indirectly related essential and or necessitated psychological needs, most related to the need for meaning in life and or uniqueness. Uniqueness more uniquely is associated most with self-desires, be it that individuals tend to engage more unique volitions and or conducts shaped by one's unique self-desires, originating within subjectivity, that are often the pivot points away from desiring to imitate others and or engage more originality and or the intrinsic creativities within one's being, exploring for oneself what is most meaningful that one's more likely to connect with in one's privacy, and or distinguish one's need for individual autonomy within the self-desiring, engaging often more complex emotional monitoring and or conflict within one's being within the anterior cingulate cortex that's connected to various mind wandering and or then refining the mind wandering into more deliberate and or cognizance within introspections connected to the prefrontal cortex that is associated with most dopamine projections that is fueling intrinsic motivations. And this should make sense as intrinsic motivations in terms of the dopamine influxes one is metabolizing in terms of the synthesis and release and or reuptake of dopamine, in terms of reconsuming the dopamine and or experiencing more complex and or sustained desires, fueling future-oriented conducts to satisfy what one desires within certain self-preferences in relation to specifically certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs, to the exclusion of wants and or irrelevant desires. One may think one desires, yet the most meaningful desires are connected to certain underlying psychological needs that are most shaped by those underlying psychological needs and are most meaningfully likely to be cultivated again, instead of experiencing desire within the momentariness of one's being, that one may be more self-deceived in terms of feeling certain feelings of desire, yet upon engaging the conducts that are more likely to be misconducts are more likely to result in feelings of disappointment and or dissatisfaction, compared to feelings of satisfaction that are truly meaningful, connected to the essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs. Within the ration, one engages the appropriate step-by-step judge of the most appropriate navigations one judges. Compared to self-confidence that connects one's domain-specific self-knowledge and or self-awareness within what allowances and or disallowances one to navigate more independently certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological need satisfactions to one's appetites of the self. Meaning individuals whom are low in self-confidence tend to be more dependent. And the opposite polarity of self-confidence is insecurity-dependence, meaning individuals whom are struggling with engaging more self-confident volitions and or conducts are more likely to be the individuals whom wait for others to satisfy their essential and or necessitated needs for them, whom have difficulty satisfying their own underlying psychological needs for themselves, and whom may experience severe depression and or anxiety without the individuals whom they most rely on. In some cases may have food in the fridge, feeling hungry without desiring to cook a meal and or being able to cook a meal that is suited to their self-preferences, whom they may depend on others to engage the meaningful conducts to cook a meal for them, instead of being more independent and or exploring their self-preferences by oneself with less confidence and or more intimidation of certain future-oriented satisfactions, feeling more trepidation within what one is more intimidated by. The opposite polarity of self-desires is self-neglect, most associated with self-avoidance, that is the opposite of self-exploration. One whom engages self-neglect is more likely to have impairments and or deficiencies and or disabilities associated with navigating one's self-preferences, not always satisfying the essential and or necessitated psychological needs. They're more likely to satisfy partially, uniquely the essential psychological needs, and have most impairments with formulating the appropriate necessitated psychological needs associated with meaning in life and or uniqueness, and or cultivating the desired domain-specific knowledge that ultimately may result in more serious deficits and or impairments and or disabilities in terms of self-knowledge and or self-awareness, as knowledge that you are uninterested in and or that bores you is mostly likely to not be appropriately storaged within one's meaningful memories. One is more likely to engage more counterproductive processes and or superficial learning that is not truly engaging one's love of learning, deepening the expansivenesses of meaningful knowledge exploration and or ingestions within the consumption of knowledge processes, compared to the self-discovery one may engage. The opposite polarity of self-discovery is most related to self-abandonment in terms of avoiding the self and or averting what's meaningful to the self. Individuals whom are low in self-discovery are more likely to experience a fragmented self instead of a stronger self. Individuals whom are high in self-discovery are more likely to be interested in personality psychology and engage in personality research at the most high end of the continuum in terms of the highest scores on self-discovery. Individuals whom are engaging constantly in me-search are more likely to be interested in exploring the self instead of avoiding the self and or desiring to engage more superficial satisfactions of one's essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs associated with one's self-preferences. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one.